On a freezing night in June 2020, high in the desolate Galwan Valley, Indian and Chinese soldiers clashed in brutal hand to hand combat. In an era of high tech warfare, this battle was fought with iron rods, stones, and bare hands. No bullets, yet lives were lost. It was the deadliest confrontation between the two nuclear armed neighbors in over 4 decades. But was it just a border skirmish or part of a larger geopolitical chess game that has been unfolding for centuries? The India China border dispute is not just about land, it's about history, strategy, and national identity. Today, we will unravel the complex story behind this conflict, from colonial era maps to modern day military standoffs. Let's dive deep into one of the world's most contested borders. To truly grasp the complexity of India-China border dispute, we must journey back to the 19th century, an era of imperial expansion, shifting alliances, and the shadow of geopolitical rivalry. At that time, the British Raj was more concerned with controlling the fertile plains of the Indian subcontinent than defining its remote northern borders. The towering Himalayas seemed an impassable barrier, a natural frontier needing little attention. But everything changed when a new power emerged on the horizon: Imperial Russia. Throughout the 19th century, Tsarist Russia was expanding southward at an alarming pace. One by one, Central Asian Khanates, Bukhara, Khiva, and Kokand, fell under Russian control. This set off alarm bells in British India. The specter of Russian troops advancing towards Himalayas was no longer a distant theory, but a genuine concern. The British feared that Russia might push through Afghanistan, cross the Karakoram, and challenge British dominance in northern India. Ladakh, a high altitude region bordering Tibet, suddenly became a crucial buffer zone. Recognizing its strategic importance, the British backed Raja Gulab Singh of Jammu, whose Dogra forces invaded Ladakh in 1834 and brought it under the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir. By the 1840s, the British firmly established Ladakh as part of their defensive strategy against potential Russian incursions. In 1846, after the First Anglo-Sikh War, the Treaty of Amritsar formalized this arrangement, making Gulab Singh the Maharaja of Jammu and Kashmir, reinforcing Ladakh's role as a northern shield. But Ladakh was only part of the equation. As the Great Game, the covert struggle between Britain and Russia intensified, another territory caught the British eye: Tibet. While Russia had yet to extend direct control over Tibet, the British feared that Russian agents might exploit Tibetan instability to establish influence. The uncertainty surrounding Tibet's political status made it a potential chess piece in the Anglo-Russian rivalry. These fears materialized in 1903 when, under orders from Lord Curzon, British forces led by Colonel Francis Younghusband launched a military expedition into Tibet. The expedition, intended to block Russian influence, ended with a brutal British victory and the signing of the Anglo-Tibetan Convention in 1904, which forced Tibet to accept British terms. However, this control was short-lived. By 1910, China reasserted itself in Tibet, sending troops to reclaim authority over Lhasa, further complicating the border situation. By the early 20th century, with Russia and China both vying for influence, Britain decided it was time to clearly define India's northeastern boundary. In 1913-1940, British India hosted the Shimla Conference, where British officials, Tibetan representatives, and Chinese envoys debated the frontiers of the Himalayas. Here, Sir Henry McMahon, the Foreign Secretary of British India, proposed a boundary between India and Tibet, which would later be known as the McMahon Line. Under this agreement, Tibet would cede a vast stretch of land to British India, an area that corresponds to present-day Arunachal Pradesh. The Tibetan delegation, recognizing British protection as a counterweight to Chinese dominance, agreed to the McMahon Line. However, the Chinese representatives, hesitant and under pressure from Beijing, ultimately refused to sign the final agreement. They later rejected the McMahon Line, claiming Tibet had no authority to negotiate its own borders. The British had three key reasons for pushing the McMahon Line. First, the Russian threat. Even though Russia never reached Tibet directly, Britain feared it could use the region to establish influence in the Himalayas. The McMahon Line secured India's eastern flank. Second, China's growing presence in Tibet. China's 1910 invasion of Tibet worried the British, who wanted a clear boundary to prevent Chinese expansion southward. Third, a defensive buffer. The Himalayas were seen as a natural fortress. By securing the McMahon Line, Britain sought to establish a well-defined defense line against any northern threats. By the time India gained independence in 1947, these disputed borders became India's legacy. China, having never formally accepted the McMahon Line, continued to view Arunachal Pradesh as South Tibet. Meanwhile, in the western sector, Ladakh's strategic importance only grew after China took control of Tibet in 1950. As the People's Republic of China consolidated power, a new phase of India-China tensions began, culminating in the border conflict of the 1950s and the full-scale war of 1962. This brings us to the next chapter of our story, the post-independence border disputes. Leading up to the war of 1962, how did the newly independent India handle its inherited colonial borders? And what led to the clash that reshaped modern India-China relations? Let's explore this in the next section. As the sun set on British rule in 1947, India inherited a complex and undefined northern border. With Tibet still a semi-independent buffer and China undergoing a communist revolution, the geopolitical landscape was rapidly changing. In these early years, India pursued a policy of goodwill toward China, believing that two ancient civilizations, newly freed from colonialism, could coexist peacefully. But the reality was far more complicated. India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, believed in fostering strong relations with China. In 1950, when the People's Republic of China under Mao Zedong sent troops into Tibet and annexed it, Nehru hoped diplomacy could prevent further conflict. Despite concerns raised by Indian officials, including Sardar Patel, Nehru recognized Chinese sovereignty over Tibet, assuming that this would lead to a peaceful resolution of border issues. In 1954, India and China signed the Panchsheel Agreement, emphasizing peaceful coexistence. The slogan, Hindi Chini Bye Bye, Indians and Chinese are brothers, became popular. However, behind this diplomatic warmth, China was strengthening its hold on Tibet, building roads and expanding its military presence, moves that would soon lead to serious disputes. While India was focused on diplomacy, China was quietly constructing a vital road linking its western province of Xinjiang to Tibet, cutting right through Aksai Chin, an area India considered part of Ladakh. This G219 highway, completed in 1957, was a strategic move by China, ensuring direct military access between Tibet and Xinjiang. But India didn't even learn about this road until 1958 through intelligence reports. The discovery of the road came as a shock to New Delhi. Nehru initially dismissed concerns, believing China would negotiate. However, the situation escalated in 1959 when China fully crushed the Tibetan uprising against its rule. The Dalai Lama fled to India seeking asylum. This angered Beijing, which saw India's support for Tibetan refugees as an interference in its internal affairs. Tension between the two countries began to rise. By the late 1950s, border skirmishes increased. In 1959, Indian and Chinese troops clashed at Longju, Arunachal Pradesh, and Konga Pass, Ladakh, resulting in casualties. This confrontation shattered the illusion of friendship. China claimed that the McMahon Line was invalid and that Arunachal Pradesh or South Tibet rightfully belonged to China. Nehru, under domestic pressure, adopted a forward policy, establishing military outposts closer to the disputed border to assert India's claims. China, viewing this as a provocation, warned India repeatedly. But Nehru, confident that China wouldn't escalate matters, believed diplomacy could still prevent war. Then, in October 1962, China launched a massive invasion across the Himalayas. The Sino-Indian War had begun. Chinese forces, well prepared for high altitude combat, overwhelmed Indian troops in both Aksai Chin and Arunachal Pradesh. The Indian military, caught off guard and poorly equipped for the harsh condition, suffered heavy losses. After a month of intense fighting, China declared a unilateral ceasefire on November 21, 1962, withdrawing from Arunachal but maintaining control over Aksai Chin, a position it holds to this day. The war ended, but the wounds remain. India learned a hard lesson about the importance of border security, while China solidified its hold over Tibet and Aksai Chin. The India-China border dispute remains unresolved, flaring up periodically, as seen in the Galwan Valley clash of 2020. As we analyze today's tension, we must ask, what have India and China learned from history? And how will this century-old dispute shape the future of Asia? Let's discuss in the next section. The 1962 war left deep scars on India's strategic thinking. While China retained control over Aksai Chin, the border dispute didn't end, it only evolved. Over the decades, both countries have built infrastructure, fortified positions, and engaged in diplomatic talks, yet tensions persist. In this section, we explore how the India-China border conflict has shaped modern geopolitics, security strategies, and bilateral relations. After the 1962 war, India ramped up its military presence along the Himalayan frontier. However, for decades, infrastructure development remained slow, while China rapidly built roads, airstrips, military bases in Tibet and Aksai Chin. This gave the People's Liberation Army a logistical advantage in any future conflict. India, realizing the strategic imbalance, accelerated its own border development in the 2000s. China, viewing these developments as a threat, responded by increasing its own military presence. The fragile peace along the line of actual control has been tested repeatedly. In 2017, a major standoff occurred in Doklam, where Indian troops intervened to block a Chinese road construction project near Bhutan's border. The standoff lasted 73 days, highlighting the growing tension between the two Asian giants. Then, in June 2020, the most serious clash in decades erupted in Galwan Valley, Ladakh. In brutal hand-to-hand combat, 20 Indian soldiers and an unknown number of Chinese troops lost their lives. This confrontation shattered the illusion that economic ties could prevent military conflict. Since then, both sides have deployed thousands of additional troops, modernized weaponry, and built infrastructure, making the border more militarized than ever before. Despite the tensions, both countries have repeatedly engaged in diplomatic negotiations. Over 20 rounds of military talks have been held to ease tensions, leading to partial disengagement in some areas. However, deep mistrust remains. While India demands a return to pre-2020 positions, China continues to assert its claims, especially in Arunachal Pradesh. At the global stage, China's assertiveness in the South China Sea, its growing partnership with Pakistan, and India's participation in alliances like the Quad with the US, Japan, and Australia further complicate the relationship. As the world's two most populous nations and rising economic powers, India and China face a critical choice. Will they continue down the path of conflict, or will diplomacy prevail? With nuclear capabilities, powerful economies, and global influence, their relationship will shape not just Asia, but the entire world. The border dispute remains a test of patience, strategy, and diplomacy. As history has shown, unresolved tensions can escalate unexpectedly. The key question remains, will India and China learn from the past or repeat the mistakes of history? Despite the ongoing border dispute, India and China remain deeply intertwined economically. China is India's largest trading partner, with bilateral trade crossing $135 billion in 2023. But the relationship is far from balanced. India runs a massive trade deficit, importing Chinese electronics, machinery, and medical equipment while exporting raw materials like iron ore and cotton. On one hand, China's investments in India have fueled sectors like technology, telecom, and manufacturing. Chinese smartphone brands like Xiaomi, Oppo, and Vivo dominate the Indian market. However, after the 2020 Galwan clash, India began restricting Chinese influence, banning over 200 Chinese apps, including TikTok, and tightening FDI rules for Chinese companies. Despite political tensions, trade has continued to grow. India has been pushing for Atmanirbhar Bharat, a self-reliance movement aimed at reducing dependence on China. However, replacing Chinese imports overnight is nearly impossible, especially in sectors like pharmaceuticals, electronics, and solar energy. Beyond direct trade, India and China are also competing for influence on the global stage. While China pushes its Belt and Road Initiative, India has joined alliances like the Quad to counter Chinese dominance in the Indo-Pacific. However, both remain key players in BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, indicating that while they are strategic rivals, economic pragmatism still plays a role in diplomacy. India is also strengthening ties with Western nations for trade and technology collaborations. The push to diversify supply chains, often called the China Plus One strategy, has led global business to look at India as an alternative to Chinese manufacturing. The India-China relationship remains a complex mix of economic interdependence and strategic rivalry. While both countries need each other for trade, the border dispute remains a shadow over economic cooperation. The real challenge is whether diplomacy and economic interests can override historical tensions, or if geopolitical conflicts will derail economic ties further. With military tensions on one side and deep economic ties on the other, India and China find themselves in a delicate balancing act. Can trade be a bridge for peace, or will strategic conflicts continue to drive them apart? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Learners Academy for more engaging historical and geopolitical content. See you